Did someone seriously hire her? Charles Whitmore's laugh sliced through the crystal ballroom, loud enough to silence the string quartet for a heartbeat. Every head turned toward the young black maid standing beside a silver service cart, her white gloves trembling around a polished tray. Warm chandelier light shimmered across the marble floor, reflecting broken circles of gold beneath her worn black shoes. Naomi Carter lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in quiet control. The tray had tilted only slightly after a guest brushed past her shoulder, yet Charles acted as if she had ruined the entire evening. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored tuxedo and smirked. Careful. Some jobs only require carrying plates. Do not make that look difficult. Laughter rippled across the room. A woman lifted her champagne glass to hide a grin. A man near the orchestra shook his head with amused disbelief. Naomi bent gracefully, collecting the single fallen fork from the marble floor before anyone else could move. The cool metal rested in her hand as she inhaled slowly. She had promised herself before walking into Whitmore Manor that nothing tonight would break her composure. She needed this job. Her grandmother's medical bills covered the kitchen table back home like a second tablecloth, each envelope stamped in red. Losing this position was not an option. Charles watched her straighten. Look at me when I speak. His voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. Naomi raised her eyes. The room felt suddenly smaller. The soft music faded beneath the hum of expensive conversations and the quiet hiss of hidden air vents. Every polished surface reflected the same image, a billionaire in command and a maid expected to disappear. Charles stepped closer, the scent of expensive cologne mixing with fresh lilies arranged along the grand staircase. You know what separates people like me from people like you? He asked. Naomi remained silent. Names, he answered himself. Family names open doors. Yours probably gets printed on a cleaning schedule. Another wave of laughter spread through the guests. Someone whispered, She should be grateful she is even here. Naomi's fingers tightened around the silver fork until the cool metal pressed against her palm. Still, her expression never cracked. Across the ballroom, the grandfather clock chimed once. The deep note rolled through the mansion like distant thunder. An elderly butler hurried toward Charles carrying a leather portfolio. Sir, Human Resources needs your signature before midnight. New employee verification. Charles accepted it without taking his eyes off Naomi. Perfect timing, he said with another mocking smile. Let us see who we invited into my house. He flipped open the folder casually while guests resumed their conversations, assuming the entertainment was over. Naomi quietly lifted the tray again. The crystal glasses clinked softly with each controlled breath she took. She started toward the service hallway, hoping to disappear into the shadows where no one expected anything from her. Behind her came the crisp sound of paper turning. Then another page. Then complete silence. No laughter. No orchestra. Even the server stopped walking. Naomi felt the room change before she heard a single word. Charles was no longer smiling. His hand had frozen halfway down the page. The color drained from his face as his eyes locked onto one line inside the personnel file. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Slowly, almost against his own will, he lifted his head and stared directly at Naomi as if he were looking at someone he had been searching for his entire life. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, Where did you get that name? No one answered. The silence settled over the ballroom so heavily that even the ice cubes stopped clinking against crystal glasses. Naomi slowly turned, her polished shoes barely making a sound across the marble floor. The warm glow from the chandeliers caught the silver name badge pinned neatly to her uniform. It is my father's name, she said quietly. And my mother's before that. Charles Whitmore stared at the file as though the letters were rearranging themselves before his eyes. Naomi Evelyn Carter. Date of birth. Emergency contact. Grandmother. Everything else blurred beneath one line that refused to let him breathe. Mother's name, Evelyn Carter. His thumb tightened against the edge of the paper. A memory crashed through decades of carefully built walls. Rain hammered twisted steel. Smoke rolled across a dark highway. A woman with trembling hands pulled open the crushed driver's door while everyone else stood frozen. "Stay with me," she had whispered. "Do not close your eyes." Charles blinked hard. The ballroom returned, but his heartbeat remained somewhere on that lonely road 25 years earlier. "Sir?" the butler asked cautiously. Charles did not respond. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Only moments ago they had laughed with him. Now the most powerful man in the room looked as though the floor beneath him had disappeared. Naomi shifted the tray slightly, preparing to leave before another insult came. She had learned long ago that silence often hurt less than arguing. Every second she remained in the ballroom felt like standing beneath a spotlight that refused to move away. "Wait!" Charles's voice was different now. Lower. Unsteady. Naomi stopped but did not turn around immediately. A manager hurried toward her, his polished shoes clicking sharply across the marble. "Miss Carter," he whispered nervously, "please remain where you are." She looked at him with quiet confusion. Charles closed the folder, then opened it again as if hoping the words had somehow changed. They had not. His pulse echoed in his ears. Evelyn Carter. He had spent years trying to find the woman who vanished before the ambulance even reached the hospital. Every private investigator had failed. Every newspaper advertisement had led nowhere. The only thing he had ever known was her first name. Evelyn. A guest stepped beside Charles with an amused smile. "Everything all right?" "It is just a maid." Charles did not even look at him. His eyes never left Naomi. "Who raised you?" he asked. The question caught everyone off guard. Naomi hesitated. "My grandmother." "Your mother?" Her fingers tightened around the tray. "She passed away when I was 8. A faint gasp drifted through the room. Charles lowered his head for only a second. Something inside him cracked. The woman who had saved his life had died without ever knowing the future she protected had become one of the wealthiest men in America. Meanwhile, her daughter had been standing in his home wearing white gloves, serving drinks while he mocked her in front of hundreds of people. Heat rushed into his face. For the first time in years, Charles Whitmore felt ashamed of his own voice. Across the ballroom, Naomi noticed an old framed photograph hanging beside the grand staircase. Even from a distance, something about it looked strangely familiar. She narrowed her eyes. A younger Charles stood beside a hospital bed, shaking hands with a physician. Around his wrist was a faded blue hospital bracelet. Naomi's breathing slowed. She had seen that exact photograph before. Not in this mansion. In an old cardboard box hidden beneath her grandmother's bed, alongside a newspaper clipping and a sealed envelope that had never been opened. Before she could speak, an elderly housekeeper suddenly dropped a serving tray with a sharp metallic crash. Her trembling voice broke the silence. "Sir, she still has the letter." The shattered tray echoed through the ballroom, and every conversation died instantly. The elderly housekeeper stood frozen, one trembling hand covering her mouth. "She still has the letter," she repeated, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Naomi frowned. "What letter?" The old woman looked from Naomi to Charles, her eyes glistening beneath the chandelier light. "Your grandmother never threw it away." Charles felt the air leave his lungs. "What letter?" he demanded. The housekeeper swallowed. "The one you sent 25 years ago." A wave of confusion swept across the guests. Phones quietly appeared beneath tables. Tiny camera lenses caught every movement as whispers rippled through the room. Charles shook his head. "That is impossible." His polished shoes scraped softly across the marble as he stepped closer. "I never found her. Every investigator failed. Because she never wanted to be found," the housekeeper replied. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. She remembered the old cedar chest beneath her grandmother's bed. The faded blue envelope tied with a thin white ribbon. She had asked about it dozens of times growing up. Her grandmother always smiled sadly and answered the same way. "Some promises arrived too late." Charles stared at Naomi. "You have never opened it?" She slowly shook her head. She told me it belonged to the past. The billionaire looked as though someone had erased 25 years from his face. His confidence had vanished, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. Around them, expensive watches reflected flashes of light from raised phones. Nobody laughed anymore. They were witnessing something none of them understood. A young executive stepped beside Charles and lowered his voice. "Sir, perhaps we should continue this in private." Charles did not even acknowledge him. His attention remained fixed on Naomi. "Bring me that letter," he said quietly. Naomi did not move. The request hung in the air between them like a suspended bridge. "No," she answered. The word landed harder than anyone expected. Several guests exchanged startled looks. No one spoke to Charles Whitmore that way. His jaw tightened from instinct rather than anger. "You do realize who you are talking to?" Naomi met his eyes without blinking. "Yes." Her voice remained calm. "Do you realize who my mother was?" The ballroom fell silent again. Charles had no answer. Naomi carefully placed the silver tray onto a nearby table. The crystal glasses gave a soft chime as they settled. "My grandmother spent years waiting for someone who never came," she said. "Every birthday she looked toward the mailbox. Every Christmas she checked the front porch before sunrise. She never stopped believing someone remembered." Charles felt heat rise behind his eyes. "I searched." "Maybe," Naomi replied. "But searching and finding are not the same thing." The words struck deeper than any accusation. His shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly. Across the room, the orchestra remained perfectly still, bows suspended above silent strings. Even the servers stopped breathing loudly. Then the butler hurried toward Charles carrying a tablet with an anxious expression. "Sir, there is something you need to see immediately." Charles glanced down. Security footage from the mansion's front entrance filled the screen. The timestamp showed barely 20 minutes earlier. Naomi had arrived carrying nothing except a worn canvas bag. But just before entering through the service door, an elderly woman in a wheelchair had reached into that bag, slipped a faded blue envelope inside, squeezed Naomi's hand, and whispered something the camera could not hear. Charles slowly looked back at Naomi. "Your grandmother knew you were coming here tonight." Naomi's eyes widened. She had never felt the envelope. She had never known it was there. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the canvas bag. The room watched without a sound. When she finally pulled out the faded blue envelope sealed with yellowed wax, Charles recognized his own signature written across the front. Then Naomi turned it over, and both of them froze. Across the back, in her mother's handwriting, were 7 words that changed everything. "Do not let Charles Whitmore read this alone." No one reached for the envelope. It rested in Naomi's hands like it carried its own gravity, the yellowed wax seal catching the cold white light from the crystal chandeliers. The whispering crowd leaned forward as dozens of phone cameras continued recording in absolute silence. Charles Whitmore swallowed hard. "Open it," he said. Naomi looked down at the handwriting one more time. "My mother told you not to read it alone." Charles stepped closer. "Your mother is gone." Naomi slowly lifted her eyes. "Then maybe she knew someone else was supposed to hear it too." A ripple of uncertainty spread across the ballroom. Charles had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without blinking, but now a single sealed envelope made his hands unsteady. His chief legal officer finally stepped forward. "Sir, I strongly recommend ending this immediately. Every phone in this room is recording." Charles barely acknowledged him. His reputation no longer felt like the biggest threat in the room. Naomi carefully broke the brittle wax seal. The quiet crack echoed louder than anyone expected. Inside rested 2 folded sheets and an old brass key wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. A soft gasp escaped the elderly housekeeper. "She kept it." Naomi unfolded the first page with careful fingers. The paper trembled slightly, not from fear but from age. Her eyes moved across the first few lines. She stopped breathing for a moment. Charles watched every tiny change in her expression. "Read it," he whispered. Naomi looked up. "She did not write this for the room." Then read the part that concerns me. Naomi hesitated before speaking. Charles, if you are reading this, it means you finally found my family. If that day ever comes, do not thank me. Charles closed his eyes. The memory of rain, twisted steel, and flashing ambulance lights rushed back again. Naomi continued. You already paid the price the night I pulled you from that car. Murmurs swept through the guests. Charles frowned. What does that mean? Naomi turned the page. Her heartbeat grew louder than the orchestra that still refused to play. There is more. The second paragraph had been stained by old watermarks. She read carefully. The doctors told me that after donating blood to save your life, they discovered something growing inside me. I never blamed you. Promise me you will never blame yourself. Charles's face drained of color. His breathing became shallow. The elderly housekeeper quietly covered her mouth as tears formed in her eyes. The legal officer shifted uneasily. Sir, perhaps this should stop. Charles raised one hand without looking away from Naomi. Keep reading. Naomi's voice softened. If you truly wish to honor me, do not spend your life searching for me. Spend it seeing the people everyone else ignores. Silence crushed the ballroom. Every guest suddenly remembered the jokes. The laughter. The woman carrying glasses whom they had treated as invisible less than 10 minutes earlier. Charles looked toward Naomi's white gloves. He remembered mocking those same hands. Heat burned behind his eyes. Then Naomi unfolded the final page. Her expression changed instantly. Confusion. Then disbelief. Then something far more frightening. What is it? Charles asked. Naomi did not answer. She was staring at the bottom of the letter where a second signature appeared beneath her mother's. It was written in darker ink, fresher than the rest. Not 25 years old. Barely a few months old. Someone had added another message. The ballroom seemed to tilt beneath everyone's feet. Naomi finally whispered the words aloud. If you are reading this now, do not trust anyone standing inside Whitmore Manor tonight. Every head instinctively turned towards someone else. Before anyone could speak, every chandelier in the ballroom flickered at once, the lights dimmed, and the entire security system emitted one long mechanical warning tone that echoed through the mansion. The warning tone echoed through Whitmore Manor like a heartbeat gone wrong. 1 second later, the emergency lights washed the ballroom in a cold white glow, turning polished silver into sharp reflections and every anxious face into a ghost. Phone cameras remained raised. No one dared lower them now. Charles Whitmore spun toward his security chief. Lock every entrance. Nobody leaves. The command cracked through the silence, but instead of restoring order, it deepened the panic. Investors exchanged nervous glances. A woman quietly stepped away from her husband. 2 executives slipped their phones into their pockets, as if suddenly afraid of being seen. Naomi stood perfectly still, the letter resting in one hand, the old brass key in the other. Her pulse raced, but her eyes were somewhere else. She was listening. Beneath the frightened whispers and the distant alarm, she heard it. A low mechanical vibration rolled through the marble floor every few seconds. It was subtle, almost hidden beneath the building's ventilation system. She looked toward the east wing. Do you hear that? Nobody answered. Charles snapped. This is not the time. Naomi did not look at him. Something is running that should not be running. The security chief frowned. The backup generators activated after the system alert. Naomi slowly shook her head. No. She closed her eyes for one brief moment. The vibration came again. Longer this time. That is not a generator. Several guests stared at her with open disbelief. One investor scoffed. She cleans floors. Now she is an engineer? A few uneasy chuckles escaped the crowd, but they died almost immediately. Naomi opened her eyes. Generators stay steady. That sound is cycling every 8 seconds. She counted softly under her breath. 1, 2, 3. The vibration returned exactly when she expected. Even the security chief turned toward the hallway. Charles felt a chill climb his spine. Before anyone could speak again, the ballroom lights flickered once more. This time the vibration became stronger. Crystal glasses rattled gently against silver trays. A chandelier swayed almost imperceptibly overhead. Every conversation stopped. Naomi looked directly at Charles. "How old is this mansion?" 112 years, he answered automatically. "Any recent renovations?" "The wine cellar expansion last year." Naomi's breathing slowed. "Under the ballroom?" Charles hesitated. "Yes." Naomi stared at the floor beneath them. "Then everybody needs to move away from the center of this room." The legal officer threw up his hands. "This is ridiculous. We are taking orders from a maid because of a mysterious letter?" Another executive nodded. "She is creating panic." Charles looked from Naomi to the trembling crystal chandelier above. Pride battled instinct across his face. His entire career had been built on trusting experts, not strangers in uniforms. Yet every expert in the room had missed the warning in the letter. Naomi had not. The vibration returned again. Louder. This time several champagne flutes tipped over, spilling across the linen-covered tables. Gasps rippled through the guests. Charles took one uncertain step backward. The legal officer grabbed his arm. "Sir, if you evacuate now without proof, the media will destroy you. Investors will think the estate is unsafe." Charles looked at the cameras recording every second. Millions of dollars. His reputation. His legacy. All balanced against the instincts of the woman he had mocked less than an hour earlier. Naomi spoke quietly, almost pleading. "Do not wait until everyone believes me." Charles stared into her eyes. There was no fear there. Only certainty. His shoulders finally dropped. "Everybody," he began. But before he could finish, a deafening metallic crack rolled up from beneath the ballroom floor. The marble trembled under every foot. A decorative bronze floor vent near the center of the room burst open with a blast of hot air, and from the darkness below came the unmistakable sound of someone pounding desperately against a locked steel door. The pounding stopped. Just like that. The sudden silence felt heavier than the alarm that had filled the mansion seconds before. Every guest stood frozen, their breathing shallow, their eyes locked on the bronze vent where a wave of lingering heat still shimmered through the cold white light. Somewhere in the distance, a phone vibrated against a marble tabletop, but no one reached for it. Naomi slowly stepped toward the vent, her shoes echoing softly across the polished floor. Charles instinctively reached out. "Do not!" She paused and looked at him. For the first time that evening, there was no arrogance left in his face. Only fear. "If someone is down there," he said quietly, "we do not know what we are walking into." Naomi glanced at the old brass key resting in her palm. Her thumb brushed across its worn teeth. It felt smooth from decades of use. "Maybe," she answered. "Or maybe they already knew we were coming." The words settled over the room like dust after an explosion. The security chief knelt beside the damaged vent, listening carefully. Nothing. The strange vibration that had shaken the ballroom was fading, replaced by a deep mechanical stillness. The mansion itself seemed to be holding its breath. Charles loosened his tie without realizing he was doing it. Sweat cooled against the back of his neck despite the air conditioning humming overhead. He had spent his life controlling every room he entered. Tonight, he no longer controlled his own heartbeat. The elderly housekeeper slowly approached Naomi. Tears glistened in her eyes. "Your mother used to stand exactly like that," she whispered. "When everyone else panicked, she became quieter." Naomi looked at her in surprise. The old woman smiled through trembling lips. "She always listened before she acted." Around them, the guests exchanged uncertain glances. The same people who had laughed at Naomi less than an hour earlier now watched every movement she made, waiting for her to decide what happened next. The shift was almost invisible, but impossible to ignore. Respect had quietly replaced ridicule. The legal officer cleared his throat. "Sir, the police are 5 minutes away." Charles barely looked at him. "Tell them to wait outside." "Sir?" Nobody enters until we know what is beneath this house. His own words surprised him. For the first time in years, he had chosen instinct over image. Naomi crouched beside the vent. Warm air drifted upward in slow pulses. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. Then she frowned. It is quieter. The security chief nodded. The machinery stopped. Naomi gently shook her head. No. She placed 2 fingertips against the bronze frame. Someone stopped it. A chill swept across the room. Charles slowly looked toward the long service hallway disappearing into darkness beyond the ballroom. Every light down that corridor remained on, but somehow it looked darker than before. Empty. Waiting. One of the younger investors nervously laughed. This is getting ridiculous. His voice echoed much louder than he expected. Nobody joined him. Even he looked embarrassed by the sound. The mansion answered with silence. Naomi stood again, still holding the brass key. She finally noticed something etched into the metal beneath years of scratches. Tiny engraved letters almost worn away by time. She turned the key toward the chandelier light. Charles stepped beside her. Together they read the inscription. Archive Level B. Either of them spoke. The elderly housekeeper inhaled sharply. There is no Level B, she whispered. Not anymore. Charles looked at her. What do you mean? Her eyes filled with fear. Your grandfather sealed it before you were born. Every person in the ballroom felt the temperature drop. Charles slowly turned toward the portrait gallery lining the western wall. One painting suddenly caught his attention. It had hung there his entire life. An ordinary oil portrait of his grandfather standing beside the mansion staircase. Except now, the staircase in the painting had one extra door beneath it. A door that did not exist anywhere inside Whitmore Manor today. Naomi followed his gaze. Without saying a word, she raised the brass key. It matched the painted lock perfectly. The brass key hovered inches from the portrait, and no one in the ballroom dared to breathe. The cold chandelier light reflected across its worn edges while dozens of phone cameras remained fixed on Naomi's steady hand. Charles Whitmore stood beside her, no longer leading the room, only waiting. The mansion felt impossibly still. Even the ventilation had fallen silent. Naomi studied the painting without touching it. Her eyes traced every brushstroke, every shadow, every crack in the century-old varnish. Then she quietly stepped 3 feet to the left. The door is not behind the painting, she said. Confused whispers spread through the guests. The legal officer sighed impatiently. There is no door. Naomi did not answer him. Instead, she looked down at the marble floor beneath the portrait. The black and white stone tiles formed a geometric pattern stretching across the gallery. Most people saw decoration. Naomi saw interruption. One square near the wall reflected the chandelier differently, almost imperceptibly duller than the others. She knelt, her fingertips gliding across the cool marble. This tile was replaced. Charles frowned. How can you tell? Because the stone is younger. She gently tapped the surface with the brass key. Tick. Tick. Then one tile answered with a hollow echo. Every head turned toward the sound. The security chief immediately crouched beside her, repeating the taps. His face tightened. She is right. A ripple of disbelief swept through the room. The same executives who had mocked her now stared in complete silence. One investor slowly lowered his phone, forgetting he had been recording. Charles dropped to one knee beside Naomi, expensive fabric brushing against polished marble without hesitation. It was the first time anyone in the room had ever seen him kneel before another person. What do we do? He asked. Naomi looked at the portrait once more. Your grandfather hid the entrance where nobody would think to look. She carefully inserted the brass key into what appeared to be nothing more than an ornamental bronze floor trim beside the wall. The key fit perfectly. A soft metallic click echoed beneath the marble. Then another. Deep inside the mansion, ancient gears awakened after decades of silence. Low mechanical vibrations rolled beneath everyone's feet. The wall behind the portrait trembled almost imperceptibly. Several guests stepped backward. One woman covered her mouth as dust drifted from the ceiling in thin silver ribbons. The security chief whispered, "This building has another level." Charles stared at Naomi with open disbelief. "How did you know?" She remained focused on the wall. "My grandmother always said old houses remember where people stop telling the truth." The words settled over him like a confession. Slowly, with a deep groan of hidden steel, the portrait shifted several inches sideways. Behind it stood a narrow iron door no blueprint had ever mentioned. The room fell completely silent. The engraved lock matched the brass key exactly. Charles looked around the ballroom. Every guest was watching Naomi now. Not because she wore a maid's uniform. Because she was the only person who had seen what everyone else had missed. The legal officer lowered his eyes. The investors who had laughed earlier avoided looking at her altogether. Humiliation had changed direction without a single raised voice. Charles swallowed hard. "Miss Carter." He stopped himself. The title felt wrong now. "Naomi." She met his eyes. "You believe the house belonged to your family?" He nodded faintly. "It belonged to the truth first." Without another word, she turned the brass key. The lock released with a heavy metallic thud. A rush of warm, stale air escaped from the darkness beyond, carrying the scent of aged cedar, machine oil, and forgotten paper. Lights hidden somewhere below flickered on one by one, illuminating a staircase descending into shadows untouched for generations. Everyone expected Naomi to step forward. She did not. She looked at Charles instead. "Your family hid it." Her voice was calm. "You should be the first to see what they buried." Charles slowly stepped toward the open doorway, his hands trembling. Then his eyes caught something resting on the first stair. A fresh white envelope. Clean. Untouched by dust. It had been placed there only recently. Across the front, written in unmistakable black ink, were 5 words that made the color drain from his face. "Charles. I knew you would come." Charles Whitmore did not touch the envelope. His hand hovered above it, trembling beneath the pale chandelier light, before falling slowly to his side. For the first time in decades, he looked like a man afraid of the truth instead of a man powerful enough to command it. The staircase remained silent. Warm air drifted upward from the hidden level below, carrying the faint scent of cedar and old paper while the last vibration beneath the mansion faded into stillness. Behind him, nobody spoke. Investors who had arrived expecting another glamorous Whitmore gala now stood motionless, their phones lowered, their expressions stripped of certainty. Naomi remained one step behind Charles. She never reached for the envelope. She never stepped ahead of him. Her calm somehow carried more authority than every expensive suit in the room combined. Charles finally bent down and lifted the envelope with careful hands. It was light. Almost weightless. Yet it felt heavier than every contract he had ever signed. He slowly unfolded the single page inside. His eyes moved across the first sentence. They stopped. His shoulders dropped. A long breath escaped him before anyone heard a word. Naomi watched quietly. She recognized that silence. It was the same silence her grandmother carried whenever the past returned without warning. Charles swallowed before reading aloud. "Charles, if you found this, then Naomi found you first." A murmur swept across the ballroom. He continued, his voice softer with every line. "That is how I always hoped it would happen. Because if you met her before you knew who she was, your heart would reveal who you truly became." Charles closed his eyes. Every cruel word he had spoken earlier echoed through his memory with unbearable clarity. Learn to read. Family names matter. Printed on a cleaning schedule. They now sounded smaller than whispers inside a room that had completely abandoned him. Naomi lowered her eyes. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply listened. Charles continued reading. "If Naomi still chooses kindness after being treated unfairly, then she inherited everything that mattered from me. If she does not, do not blame her. Some wounds are earned." The final sentence caught in his throat. He could barely force the words out. "Do not repay my kindness with money." Repay it by seeing people before you judge them. The paper slowly slipped in his hands. The ballroom remained perfectly still. One by one, guests who had laughed at Naomi earlier looked away. A woman quietly wiped tears from her cheek. The young executive who had mocked her first removed his event badge and slipped it into his pocket without saying a word. Even the legal officer lowered his head. Their humiliation no longer belonged to Naomi. It belonged to themselves. Charles turned toward her. His eyes were red, not from anger, but from regret that had arrived 25 years too late. Naomi! His voice almost failed him. I cannot erase what I said. She met his gaze with the same quiet composure she had carried all evening. No. A painful silence settled between them. Charles nodded once. But I need to say it anyway. Before anyone expected it, he removed the Whitmore Foundation medallion from around his neck, the symbol every executive in the room recognized as the highest honor within his company. Without looking at the cameras or the crowd, he placed it gently into Naomi's hands. No applause followed. None was needed. The gesture said everything words could not. Naomi looked down at the medallion for several long seconds before carefully closing Charles's fingers around it again. Keep it, she said softly. You still have work to do. Charles stared at her, unable to answer. Respect spread across the ballroom, not like excitement, but like sunrise. Quiet. Certain. Irreversible. The elderly housekeeper smiled through tears. She really is Evelyn's daughter. Nobody disagreed. Then, from somewhere deep beneath the hidden staircase, a slow mechanical click echoed upward through the passage. Everyone instinctively turned toward the darkness. A single light flickered on below, revealing one old wooden desk waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Resting at its center was a leather journal, already open to a page where fresh ink seemed to shimmer beneath the light, as though someone had been writing there only moments before. The leather journal remained open beneath the single light, but nobody rushed toward it. The silence itself felt sacred now. Gone were the whispers, the laughter, the quiet judgments that had filled Whitmore Manor only an hour before. The hidden machinery beneath the estate had finally gone still, leaving only the faint hum of distant ventilation and the soft rhythm of measured breathing. Charles Whitmore descended the narrow staircase first, not because he owned the house, but because he finally understood he had spent too many years walking through it without seeing it. Naomi followed several steps behind, her shoes making almost no sound against the old stone stairs. She never tried to pass him. She never needed to. At the bottom, the journal rested beside a small framed photograph covered by a thin layer of dust. Charles gently picked it up. It showed a younger Evelyn Carter standing beside his grandfather in front of the unfinished mansion decades earlier. On the back, written in fading ink, were simple words, "The strongest foundations are built by the hands no one remembers." Charles closed his eyes. His grandfather had known Evelyn. He had trusted her. Somewhere through the years, that truth had been buried beneath wealth, pride, and silence. He opened the journal. There were no secret fortunes. No hidden ownership papers. No forgotten inheritance waiting for Naomi. Instead, every page contained handwritten notes about the people who worked inside the estate. Gardeners. Housekeepers. Cooks. Drivers. Names. Birthdays. Family stories. Medical bills quietly paid. College tuition secretly covered. Charles turned another page with trembling fingers. His grandfather had written one sentence larger than the rest. Never judge a person by the work that feeds them. Judge them by the kindness they give when no one is watching. Charles slowly closed the journal. He looked toward Naomi, but she was not looking at the book. She was looking at the photograph of her mother. The corners of her eyes glistened, yet she never wiped away the tears. She simply smiled, small and genuine, as though she had finally found the piece of her family history that had been missing her entire life. Charles stepped closer. "I spent 25 years trying to repay a debt," he said quietly. "I never realized I first needed to become the kind of man worthy of saying thank you." Naomi met his eyes. "My mother did not save your life so you would owe her," He nodded. I know. She looked once more at the photograph before gently placing it back on the desk exactly where it had rested for decades. She saved it because that was who she was. Either of them spoke again. Above them, the guests slowly descended the staircase one by one. No cameras were raised anymore. One investor quietly shook Naomi's hand. Another simply nodded with respect. The young executive who had laughed the loudest earlier stopped in front of her. He opened his mouth to apologize, then realized words were too small. He lowered his head instead. Naomi returned the gesture with a gentle smile that carried no triumph, only grace. As dawn began to filter through the tall stained glass windows above, pale golden light spilled across the old stone floor, reaching the brass key still resting beside the journal. Charles picked it up carefully and held it out toward Naomi. It belongs to your family. She looked at the key for a long moment before softly closing his hand around it once again. No, she whispered. It belongs to anyone willing to remember what this house almost forgot. Charles stood motionless as Naomi turned and quietly walked back toward the staircase. Her simple maid's uniform looked exactly the same as it had when she first arrived. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Only the eyes watching her had. Every guest instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path without a single word. The morning light followed her across the marble floor until she disappeared through the open ballroom doors. Charles remained where he was, holding the old brass key in one hand and his grandfather's journal in the other. For the first time in his life, the richest man in the room understood that the greatest inheritance he had almost lost was never hidden beneath the mansion. It had quietly walked through his front door wearing white gloves, and he had almost failed to learn her name.